And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Robbie Bickerton, who's going to be speaking on designing and delivering fully online courses in Stack, which sounds like a great thing, being able to do it fully online. So Robbie, are you ready to take it away?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Can everyone see that, hopefully? Yeah.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. I'd like to thank the organisers for the chance to speak and organising this meeting for December. So thank you very much. Indeed, I'm going to talk about a course that I wrote in a couple of years ago that is currently being delivered at the University of Edinburgh. And I should probably start out my talk on a good note by issuing an apology to any Edinburgh colleagues who may have seen a version of this talk before, but hopefully this will be of interest to or novel to most people. So the idea behind the development of this course was that my colleagues, George Kinnear and Richard Gratwick, had previously developed a similar style of course for first-year incoming maths students. And the idea was that I was to create a 20-credit course for non-maths students at a slightly lower level. The idea being that it was a foundational course around the level of higher mathematics in Scotland, or A-level maths, and it would deal with primarily with students coming from different disciplines. So it turned out that when we ran the course, we actually had quite a few students from disciplines as quite wide-ranging. Kind of economics was a popular one, a lot of psychology students, but we also had some students from the School of Biology even, and even I think I had one student from the School of Sports Science. So it really was for non-specialists. And the idea of this is that this course would be delivered online using the Stack e-assessment system, which was developed by my colleague Chris Sanguin. And it was in the style of the course that was developed by my colleagues, which I'm abbreviating to FAC, which stands for the Fundamentals of Algebra and Calculus. Now, the idea behind this was to essentially answer the question of, it turned out that FAC had been a successfully implemented course for our own maths students. Could this be implemented and be successful when we have a different target audience of students? And could we replicate the style of FAC with kind of inputting the book inside the quiz style? And hopefully you'll see what that means when I come to talk about some specifics. So the list of topics that were chosen, I've put up on the slide here. So the idea is that we had 10 topics and one topic would be studied each week. Now, one of the key difficulties designing the course was trying to decide on topics that would be suitable to students from a wide range of disciplines. So, for example, one topic on, I don't know, advanced medical statistics may not be suitable for students coming from economics, for example. But essentially, we came across these 10 subjects that we thought would provide a good range and would be useful to a wide area, a wide number of disciplines. In terms of how the course was structured, as I said, the idea of this material was that it was at kind of A level or Scottish Highers, and it would be supporting students who've done a little bit of maths in the past and they've dropped it, but realized that when they get to university, it's actually a useful subject. Or there would be students who had an interest in maths, but maybe felt it wasn't their strongest subject. So you basically, in every week, we took topics that started at that highest GCSE highest level and then pushed them as each week's topic goes along. So we began with quadratic functions and polynomials. We had a week on logic and mathematical reasoning, and then we had a couple of weeks discussing exponential functions, log functions, trigonometric functions, before moving on to some maybe slightly higher difficulty concepts such as the binomial theorem or some introductory calculus. The idea being that the students who finish this course could then go and study the other course, Foundations of Algebra and Calculus, once they'd completed this course. So in terms of what a typical week would look like inside of the Stack system. I hope you can see that big enough. I realized I've got the window on my laptop quite small left. I might increase that for myself. So here we see what this looks like for our second week. So this was to do with polynomials, functions, and graphs. And you can see that above this horizontal blue line, these are all the Stack quizzes that make up this week of the course. So every week would have an introductory section that was primarily to do with motivating the topic and trying to convince the students why this is useful to them in their specific field. We then had four lecture style quizzes, the first three of which were basically going through the mathematics material, and the fourth of which was a section primarily focused on the applications of the maths that they were discussing. So you can see that in this case, in week 2, we started out with a quiz on kind of the basic definitions of a polynomial, and then we moved on to discuss factors and remainders, so the factor and remainder theorem. We then looked at how to graph polynomials, and then in the third quiz, we had a look at the introduction to the theory of functions. And then finally, we discussed ways that this is used kind of in real life in different situations, hopefully to reinforce that motivation for the students as to why they should be studying this stuff. Now, the first year that this course ran, there was also an accompanying lecture per week. And in this lecture, I would go through some problems related to the material in the quiz. Since this course has been running a few years, it was found that upon consulting with the students and kind of my own experiences teaching the course, that the lectures weren't very well attended, nor were they particularly wanted when I asked the students. So actually, this one lecture per week, I've decided to do away with, and the students have preferred me swapping this to an interactive Q&A session. Now, I'll talk about what goes into each one of these 4 quizzes in a little bit. So, what's inside of a typical quiz? Well, it looks in Stack something like you can see on my slide. So firstly, we have some hand-typed notes, kind of in the style of a traditional textbook. So often the setup for the week's work or the motivation would be typed. We also, you can see on the slide, we also had some worked examples that were typed out and some solutions similar to a traditional textbook. We also had some things, in this case, you can see a general algorithm. I think that's for solving a quadratic. But then below that, you can also see that we made use of embedded videos. So I'll talk about this in more detail in a little while, but essentially every quiz also had some videos in which I would spend about 5 to 10 minutes going through examples live in person as well. And in general, students seem to really appreciate this. And at the bottom, you can see that we have an example of a Stack question. So essentially here, the students could type in whatever they thought the solution to this question is. So I think they have to write a quadratic in completed square form here, and the system set up and will automatically mark them and give them feedback on that. So it's really these 4 things that made up each typical quiz. And the idea was that every quiz the student would do would be roughly comparable to an hour's worth in a traditional lecture. So in terms of how we went about developing the materials for this, there were essentially 3 facets that we needed to write. The first of which was the actual content notes, the typewritten notes. Secondly, it was to develop the videos, which back in the time before the pandemic, we weren't quite as familiar with as we all are now. And finally, we had to develop the code to make the suitable Stack questions work. So most of the written notes, all that were done were hand typed by me, and they essentially take the form of Moodle description questions within Moodle. And as I've said, this really was where I spent some time going through written examples, but in some rare case, some proofs for things. The proofs were fairly minimal because, again, this was a foundation level course, but we did have a few things to do with that. In terms of videos, as I said, I kind of aimed for about 2 or 3 of these per week. And really the design that we went with was that they were to be short they were targeted, and actually the only thing that was done in videos was really me solving examples, and students found that to be a really useful thing for them to interact with. In terms of the stack questions, this is what made up the bulk of the material in the course. So again, the questions allow for randomized variance. So for example, if we think about the question solving a quadratic on the previous slide, if a student gets that wrong, we allowed them an extra attempt to do that question, but where the coefficients would be changed. So they can have essentially a number of attempts at every question. So they could practice before they took any tests that we set them. In terms of the written notes, essentially these were based upon the ideas of what do we actually want the students to get out of every week's worth of work. So essentially it was the case of trying to think of learning objectives that were suitable for each week's worth of work, and then trying to write materials to help them achieve those objectives. And the idea was that essentially the sections would each get progressively harder. The material will get more difficult, slightly more involved as they went along. And as I said, the reinforcement of this was in the application section, when it essentially exists to try and convince these non-math students why they should be enjoying and studying maths. Another thing that we also made quite a lot of use of was the use of interactive graphs and diagrams. Particularly, a lot of you could see that a lot of the topics were focused on some particular type of function. So we had a week on exponentials and logarithms, for example, and a week on polynomials. In each of these weeks, we wanted the students to be comfortable with graphing these functions and the properties of the graphs of the functions, things like this. And we found that the use of these kind of interactive graphs and diagrams to also be a useful point where the students could be interacting with the material more than they would be able to in a traditional textbook. I think I've already mentioned this, but as I say, in terms of the videos, we purposely made the decision to make these short. I think evidence showed that students wouldn't engage with longer form videos, which is the main reason that we went to this length. And essentially, as I've said, they discussed common examples. And you'll see in the feedback that students often wanted more of these videos to cover slightly more difficult topics, which seemed to suggest that these were one of the things that they found the most useful. And this essentially took quite a lot of my time to do in terms of actually implementing the course. However, what I should say is that I did also re-record a couple of these videos, and they took me a lot less time after I'd been doing videos of lectures during the pandemic. So I think the overheads to actually develop and implement a course like this are perhaps decreasing with that expertise that I think we've all gained as a sector in giving talks and giving videos not in person. So in terms of the type of example stack questions that we used, arguably we were able to provide a good variety of different things for the students to do. So as I've shown there, we had examples of just simply enter a suitable algebraic formula. So what's the solution to this quadratic? We also had cases where we've used some multiple choice questions, which I'll go into in a little bit. We also had cases of asking students to do some things regarding proof comprehension as well. And we were able to kind of get a useful variety of things for them to do during pretty much each week of the course. Another key thing is that these were randomized where possible. The idea behind this was to try and give the students as much practice as they could, and every week of to try and get them actively solving problems and actively doing the maths. And I'll go on to talk about the assessment in a little bit, but another key facet of this practice was that because actually we were assessing them every week and we didn't want this to be unfair, we knew that we would perhaps need practice before we give them any more assessment. So in terms of the types of kind of calculation questions we have, you can see here, well, I think I've actually got two different randomized variants of the same question. The image on the left is what the question looks like to the student before it's typed in. The question on the right is where a student has typed in an answer and the system has marked them correct. So you can see as a technical thing on the left, they have to enter their answer in terms of a list, which means that they have to use these square brackets. which is not necessarily the most obvious thing that they need to type into the box for the system. So we've provided them with a hint that they can just enter their answer as a y equals whatever they've found out. In this case, on the right, they've got the question correct, and the general feedback goes through precisely the way that they can get the solution. Had they got this question incorrect, the system would have allowed them another attempt at this question where the coefficients in the quadratic are different. So they get an immediate second attempt at that. I mentioned earlier that we did also do some things regarding proof comprehension questions. So in general, in STACK, we can't fully mark a student's full written proof or full written answer. But that doesn't mean there aren't some things that we can do that maybe can help us to understand whether they've actually understood a proof that they've read. So this kind of led to this kind of style of proof comprehension question. So you can see that in this case, we have a lemma, something relatively, I think, straightforward to do with divisors. And we have some steps in the proof that we've numbered the steps. And we've numbered the steps because in questions after that, we ask the students to refer to a specific step in each proof. So really, we need to number them in order for them to be able to provide some answer that the system can then mark. In addition to that, you can see that in step 3 of the lemma, we've left a calculation blank for the students to fill in. And you can also see in step 4 that in this no answer given box, what that is actually hiding is a drop-down list of 4 or 5 different options where the student has to pick the right one to complete the correct statement. And finally, we have one of the best things that STACK can be used for is kind of giving an example questions. These, if they were marked by hand, tend to take a lot of man hours to mark because if you ask a student to give an example of a 7x7 matrix, the chances of a class of 100 giving you the same matrix are very, very small. But in STACK, we can mark these things pretty much instantaneously. So in this case, we want values of A, B, and C such that the lemma is holding. What else did we do? Well, I mentioned that we also had multiple choice questions, and we also had kind of true or false questions as well. These were primarily used in week 3 of the materials, which was the week on mathematical logic, where these kind of ended up being a natural fit. The one thing to note is that here we can't really randomize these as easily as we could as solving a quadratic, because it's not immediately obvious to me, at least, how we would manage to do that. So, but other than that, these were also things that we saw in that we gave the students to do in the 3rd week. Now, in terms of perhaps what the major difference was between this and the course FAC that my colleagues developed was that we decided early on that this should have a focus on real-world applications in for each of the topics that were studied in the course. Mainly, as I said, because our students were non-specialist students. So I just have, you don't need to read what's on here, but I just have some screenshots of a typical application section. One of the difficulties with this approach is that not every student is from the same course, not every student has the same background, and therefore an application that may be easy, straightforward to a chemistry student is not going to be the same use or the same have the same level of accessibility to a student coming from economics, for example. So it's for that reason that we made sure that each of the application sections was self-contained, and any maths that we did not presume any prior knowledge. Everything was written into this section, so it could be read as if you had no knowledge prior. We also introduced some stuff to do with the history of some of the maths and kind of how it's developed over the years. And again, that seems to have been well received by the students in terms of a motivating factor. So you can see here, I think this is taken from the week on quadratics. So we have a little bit about the development of the quadratic formula. And then one of the examples we discussed is kind of the distance between traffic is modeled by some quadratic equations, which we go into in this case. And we repeated this structure every week. So we had a couple of applications for each week's worth of work. Now, in terms of how we tested the students, how did we mark it? Well, we used a mastery grading approach. And if you remember back to, I think it was my third slide, I had this little structure of a week and a horizontal blue line. Basically, everything below that blue line was the tests. Every week, we had a different topic, and we had a test every week on that topic. So I think the week 2 test in this case would be on polynomials. That was the only thing that was covered in week 2 and the only thing that they were tested on. Their final mark for the entire course was then taken as a weekly average of these 10 unit tests and a final test. The difference with the final test being that it covered questions throughout every week of the course rather than just the specific unit. Now, we used, as I say, a mastery approach to the grading, where we required 80% to pass that week's unit test and 95% to get a distinction. These were the only 2 grades that were available. And to kind of offset the fact somewhat that these are high requirements, we had a practice test before every unit test. And in order to access the unit test on the stack system, a student has to have taken the practice test and passed it. So they have to have taken the practice test and got 80% or above. Only then does the unit test unlock. So by the time they actually get to the unit test that counts, they've given evidence that we would expect them to be able to pass that test. However, if they don't, they do get an immediate option to resit. This was slightly delayed in order to give them time to read the feedback through from their first unit test and hopefully improve when they do that resit. And I should say as well, we also gave the students opportunity for feedback on each individual week of work. And the idea was that the unit test and the practice tests just consist of questions that were very, very similar to the ones that they were practicing in the lecture style quizzes. So there shouldn't be anything overtly novel. The final test, again, was essentially the same format, but the questions come from across the entire course. So I just want to kind of come to an end by discussing some of the feedback that we got for this from students. And perhaps one of the most encouraging bits is that I've not really had anyone come back and say, we're wasting our time, which is a good thing, I think. All the students seem to agree that this was interesting and that they learned new things, which is good. In particular, they were a fan of the application section. They enjoyed contextualizing some of the slightly more abstract things that they were doing. What seemed to be a problem was entering syntax into the answer boxes in the stack system. So this was a problem in the first year it ran. So the next year that the course ran, I made an introductory syntax entry quiz. So the students had to work through that and just practice entering answers. So they were familiar with how to do that in the system. And they still said that syntax entry was a problem. So I'm not 100% how to solve this. I've also given them sheets and advice on how to enter things into the system, but they still say that in some cases they find it difficult. So if anyone has any ideas of how to solve that, I'd be very open to suggestions. I think I mentioned earlier that often they desired more videos, often covering harder questions. In general, I think I'm probably inclined to not do this, mainly because those harder questions are there to differentiate stronger students, and they tend to be atypical edge cases, which aren't massively illustrative apart from solving that particular question. I may slightly change my mind on this, but I think that's potentially reasonable. What I have done, however, I've added more videos into the course where instead of looking over me handwriting examples and notes, I've shown my face, because apparently they felt that it was a bit too remote not having that in the course, especially when they didn't have the accompanying lecture every week. And that seems to have been received well, just to feel like it's a bit more of a personal approach. But overall, the students were generally positive about the course. Some other suggestions to improve: they wanted more detailed feedback on the stack questions. They wanted some more lectures, and some people wanted harder material even, which I was quite surprised about, but fair enough. What I did realize, speaking as a mathematician, was that the feedback given by the stack questions that I thought was a full general solution doesn't necessarily translate to what students specifically from different disciplines also thought was a general solution. I think there were details that I would naturally miss out that the students wanted in that feedback. So I've altered that now. In terms of
Robbie,
how did students...
Robbie, can you perhaps wrap it up? Because otherwise we won't have time.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is my last slide. So that's handy. So essentially, I want to end just by saying that essentially all the students did well. We didn't have problems with engagement, which was a fear before we started. In summary, I think the syntax, entering the syntax, seems to have been the biggest problem so far. But hopefully this is something that we can think of mitigating in the future. So as I say, that was my last slide. Sorry if I slightly overran. My slides covering my clock. So I can stop sharing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much there. Right, so we don't have much time for questions here, I don't think. So I wonder if we can just pull one out of the chat here. So a very important question about invigilating the tests. I mean, how do you stop people just using Wolfram Alpha? And
yeah, it's a reasonable point. We don't have any invigilation for that. In general, I'm not entirely sure what we can do to invigilate stay-at-home tests to completely be Wolfram proof. I think it's a reasonable concern. It was a decision we made that not that we weren't going to worry about it, but we felt that the material there was still useful to the students.
Right.
I should say I will go through the questions and reply in the chat when I can.
Right. Okay. I was going to suggest that there's a few questions there you might want to have a look at and perhaps give an answer to. So thanks very much again. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Sorry for running over.
Okay.